he laughed like, why are you doing this? Are you this weak? So I wasn't really afraid, because like the way he treated me, the way he kicked me, the way he dragged me, it just shows he's not okay here.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Foreign Friday. Today's feature is 3000 Nights. So briefly, 3000 Nights is a Palestinian movie directed by Massacre that follows Layal, a young Palestinian school teacher who is sentenced to 8 years in prison, so 3000 nights, after giving a lift to a young boy. So the movie is actually based on a true story of a Palestinian woman she had met while filming a documentary in her hometown Nablus. Mace is actually a veteran filmmaker who had spent months interviewing women who had given birth in Israeli prisons. So the movie was shot in an abandoned military prison in Jordan, and actually there were still writings and remnants from previous inmates, and that's what gives it the very chilling and haunting atmosphere. Like, you very much feel like you're in a prison, a very claustrophobic, ill-maintained prison. In addition, several members of her crew either have been incarcerated or they know someone who has been incarcerated. So this is an incredibly personal story for a lot of people involved in the making of this film. The entire film takes place in a prison, and not only that, it focuses on a young woman trying her best to raise her child, a child that has never seen the outside world. And so this acts as a powerful metaphor for the conditions that the Palestinian people have to suffer through every day. So 3000 Nights is not like a formulaic drama, and by that I mean there's no escape, there's no trial, there's no clearing of anyone's name, and that is because unfortunately they were incarcerated long before they ever were convicted. So Layal is abducted, tortured, and sentenced all without warning. Like, everything happens faster than she can react to it. And sadly, this is a practice that is all too common. Because Israel is an apartheid state, what do I mean by apartheid? You have two different groups of people that are not subject to the same law. So Israeli people are subject to civil law, and unfortunately Palestinian people are subject to military law. And this type of system is incredibly hard to fight for several reasons. So you see it in the movie, detainees often don't even really know the evidence being used against them. A lot of it is kept a secret. What's worse is that even if they serve out their sentence, they can still be held in administrative detention, which is a form of detention without trial, without charge. Like, it's very arbitrary. And they can just kind of keep that going for decades and years. In the case of Layal, she's abducted by Israeli authorities and accused of aiding and abetting a young boy by giving him a lift in her car. And this young boy is allegedly accused of terrorism. Like, I use that word incredibly lightly here. So I've divided my video into several parts. I think this movie is incredibly clever. Like, the script is very, very, very smart in terms of the number of sort of nuanced commentaries it makes, not only about the legal system, but about life for everyday people in Palestine. So Layal's ordeal begins when she unknowingly picks up a young boy whom she later finds out is accused of terrorism. Overnight, she's taken by police, blindfolded, tortured, questioned, and Layal will neither confess that she did anything wrong, nor will she save herself by throwing this young kid under the bus. Because Palestinians are under military law, we're not really sure what evidence they have against them. Like, it seems very circumstantial. Like, they very much rely on confessions or people kind of turning on each other. So it doesn't appear like they have anything on her aside from this chance encounter that she had with this young boy. We don't get a lot of information as to the charges, and I suspect the reason for that is because they don't really have much on either the young boy or Layal. And we only see this young boy once in front of a military tribunal, and he looks like he's been badly beaten, abused, suffered, unusual and cruel and unusual punishment. And it's important to note that Israel is the only country that actually has juvenile military courts and subjects children to military detention. And oftentimes these kids actually do confess because they are under extreme pressure. They're being yelled at. They don't have access to lawyers. They don't have access to parents. They're threatened. They are coerced. And actually a video that went viral of a young boy named Ahmed Manasera, who was, like, his interrogation went viral. You just had this man yelling at this kid without a parent or a lawyer present. And again, usually the only thing they have on them is their own confession. And most of these kids are charged with throwing a stone at Israeli authorities. So believe it or not, simply throwing a rock can sentence you to up to 20 years in prison. So again, whatever he was charged with, it probably just wasn't anything to kind of warrant the level of abuse that we see. On top of defendants not really having access to information, lawyers oftentimes can't really defend their clients properly. They don't see them until the day of the trial. They don't even know what their clients are being charged with until they walk into the courtroom. And oftentimes they have to accept any deal they can get for fear of harsher sentences, right? They don't have the right to access critical information. So they're working really hard just to make sure their client stays alive. So because Leal does not save herself at the expense of this young boy, she's sentenced to 8 years in prison. It's there she finds out she's pregnant, and the whole movie kind of revolves around her pregnancy. And I thought that was very, very, very clever in terms of figuring out how much time had passed. Even though Leal does not deserve to be in prison, the movie doesn't try to focus on the justice system itself, just because there's so many people and there's so many men and women who are in similar situations. So instead, the movie is much more focused on how, despite these injustices, they not only survive, but they don't really lose the will to fight, right? It seems like over the years, this fight has just gotten stronger and stronger, no matter how hard they try to beat it out of them. This movie takes place in the 80s in Nablus, which is located in the West Bank. And this was a time where prisoners had to really fight authorities for literally everything you can imagine. Not just food, pencils, basic necessities. They would ration water. Like, it was really hard to survive in there. So hunger strikes were actually very common. Tear gassing. So prison guards would often tear gas inmates for little to no reason. Like, excessive force is where they start. If you notice in the movie, like, these prisons are very overcrowded. They're poorly maintained. And this very much mirrors real life. Healthcare is substandard, right? Like, they don't really care about them too much. And sometimes the healthcare system can actually make them sick, right? Like, they're not really being looked out for in any way, shape, or form. Many Palestinians actually describe their time in prison as a kind of school where they really kind of immerse themselves in reading, learning, debating, like really trying to make sure that if they were granted the privilege to leave, that they were stronger than when they came in. And this is an important point, and you do see it in the movie where they are helping each other, they are reading to each other. And I think the reason for that is one of the tools the Israeli state uses, this apartheid state, is basically hindering human development. Like, they kind of really limit access to resources, education. They just make it very hard to get through your day, right? So the level of education that they have access to is not the same as their Israeli counterparts. And so many former prisoners actually noted how their time in prison radically altered their view in terms of the Palestinian liberation movement. And actually, they felt bad for their Israeli counterparts, and not in like a Stockholm syndrome kind of way, like in a Nelson Mandela way, where it's like, one day you're gonna pay for this. In the movie, you actually do see that men and women are kind of kept in the same area, like separate quarters, but the same sort of prison. And actually, it wasn't uncommon for some men and women to actually be held in the same area. Like, the level of violence in these prisons is actually incredibly high. Like, tactics like assault, torture by guards, routine, like, this is very systematic, and it's been documented by Amnesty International. It's been documented by the UN. The movie isn't as dark as what you're going to find out if you were to read more about it. Although most inmates are either Palestinian, Lebanese, so most of them are Arab, there were some Israeli prisoners. So during this time, political prisoners would be kept in the same prisons as regular Israeli criminals. Okay, so the Israeli women who are convicted of criminal charges are actually part of a marginalized group who suffer discrimination outside of these walls. However, despite the inequity, guards would routinely kind of pin the two sides against each other. So in the movie, you see there's a lot of altercations between the two sides, but in real life, this was not too far from the truth. So in the movie, you actually do see that the Israeli prisoners, they wear whatever they want. They're wearing regular clothes, whereas the Arab prisoners have to wear these kind of blue uniforms, again, to kind of make it clear that there's a hierarchy here. So I thought the movie did a very good job of using the setting and also like the interactions between characters to really make this commentary about what living in Palestine is like for the average person. I'll start with the guards. So the guards, you can tell in the movie, they're a bit like caricatured at times, like they could be extreme, but I felt like they really exemplified this Israeli approach of like making their presence felt. This is a tactic which pretty much revolves around violating and demolishing any boundaries Palestinians might feel they have, like any sense of safety is always just called into question. Layal is literally taken from her home in her nightgown, like just at night, out of nowhere. Obviously, it's a humiliating process, and this is quite common, right? They often go into people's homes in the middle of the night, and they just take them when they're the most vulnerable. In the movie, you can kind of see how the guards come in and out of their cells whenever they want, raiding them, destroying all the things that they have, subjecting them to torture for like the slightest inconvenience, right? It just kind of depends on whatever mood that they're in. In the real world, this tactic of making their presence felt is practiced through multiple checkpoints, constant patrolling in and out of Palestinian cities, random detentions, the restrictions of movements, closures of houses, businesses, and roads. And again, under all this under the guise of like security, right? Like we're just trying to defend ourselves. And to make matters even worse and terrifying, they actually do conduct raids regularly in people's homes and just kind of lock them in their own houses. And they can subject them to whatever they want. Like it's actually like totally uninvited, no warrants, no cause. They can just come in whenever they want. And these raids are pretty extreme. Like they kind of toss the house, they destroy things. And besides kind of making their presence felt, it's also a financial burden, right? You're making it very hard for people to set up a life that they can maintain if you're always going to go in there and just like destroy everything. In reality, and you see this with the guards, these practices obviously have nothing to do with security. They're about limiting mobility, restricting access to places, and most importantly, trying to instill this fear. So shortly after Layal is sentenced, her home is actually demolished. Again, she lives in the West Bank. This is a place that has a number of illegal Israeli settlements. These are basically Israelis forcing themselves onto Palestinian territory, any means necessary. And she finds out that her husband is abandoning her and moving to Canada because he's like, well, there's nothing else I can do. And this practice of demolishing homes, like punishing the whole family for one person, is a form of collective punishment, which is something that Israel practices very often, and it's considered illegal under international law. So when one person goes to jail, it really does feel like the whole family is in jail. The occupation is not only physical, like you're not just behind literal bars, but there's like a deep psychological aspect to it. Like in the movie, you notice that there's surveillance cameras everywhere. And it is true that Israel is actually one of the most surveilled places in the world, and yet their abuses go totally unchecked. And this mirrors real life. Like I'll give you just a brief example. So the family of an unarmed autistic Palestinian man named Ayad Halak was shot dead by Israeli police when he was literally on his way to attend his special needs class. And Israeli authorities claimed that he was carrying a gun, which they later found out was a toy. Incidentally, the location in which he was shot, the cameras just so happened to not be working, not to mention the fact that there were 10 private cameras all around the area that could have actually documented what went on. But of course, you know, it just so happened that they didn't. And even though someone was put on trial, they were found not guilty because these things happen. And again, the psychological effect is like we're always watching you, and you'll never be in a position to watch us, right? We are getting away with murder in plain sight. So this psychological torture can kind of be seen in the movie. The inmates are constantly placed in a state of extreme desperation, and although Layal kind of keeps loyal and she doesn't throw this kid under the bus, it's very easy to see why individuals would want to save themselves, or why they're very susceptible to this kind of like coercion, because there is this kind of attitude where we can do whatever we want to. So either participate or get lost in the system until the end of time, right? That's the thing about the Israeli prison system. Like, once you're in, you could be in there until the end of time. This psychological torture is perfectly played out by the birth of Layal's son, Noor. And again, revolving around the birth was incredibly like clever. Despite her husband's insistence that she gets an abortion, she refuses to get an abortion, right? She's like, I'm gonna have this kid and you can do whatever you want, but this is what I'm doing over here. And the decision for Layal to actually have her child is extremely significant, because the increase in Palestinian birth rate is very much a threat to the Israeli government. Like, they have tried time and time again to curb it by cutting off any sort of government benefits, childcare. Like, they really want to encourage them to stop having children, because in a couple of years they will the population of Palestinians will basically be higher than the population of Israelis, and this very much compromises the legitimacy of their state. So her having a child in itself is actually like very much an act of resistance. So Layal ends up having her child, and she gives birth like while she's having like handcuffs on her. And this is a practice that's very common. Like, you see this in the hospital, like everybody's handcuffed. Like, if they're having treatment, like they're just treated like terrorists regardless of what they're charged with. So they chain this woman, and then they threaten her by saying, we can totally give this child away. So according to, I guess, the way the Israeli prison system works, a child can stay with its mother up until the age of 2 or 3, and then the child is removed and sent to either, an orphanage or to a relative that can take care of them until the mother finishes her sentence. And so it's very significant that first she had a boy, and second that she had him in prison. So 40% of Palestinian men have actually gone to prison. Like, most people in Palestine either know somebody who went to jail or have been through the prison system themselves. And at the heart of the movie is this mother really trying her best to kind of maintain some hope and recreate life outside of these walls, because this child has never seen life, right? The first time they're introduced to the world, it's behind bars. As hard as she tries to introduce some sort of sense of normality, like, it's very difficult, because the occupation is not normal, right? It's not normal just in everyday life to be surrounded by walls, to be surrounded by checkpoints. Like, it gets in the way of everything. Like, simple acts like going to school is a hardship, getting ID is a hardship, just daily tasks are a hardship. Like, life is a hardship. So nobody really born in Palestine, like, they don't really have a childhood, right? This childhood is eradicated the minute you're born. And again, Israeli law is very much designed to restrict Palestinian freedom. They're so coercive that it's almost impossible for you not to break the law, because you're subject to military law. Like, you're not subject to civil law. So when you have two different sets of laws for two different people, life is very difficult, right? The fact that she's even able to give birth in a prison, and this is something that is common, tells you everything you need to know about the system. A reoccurring sort of theme in this movie is freedom, and this is articulated through a bird. So Layal's crush, she develops kind of a crush on one of the hospital attendants, and he's very charming, and he kind of gifts Noor with like a wooden bird, and this bird is meant to kind of keep his imagination alive in terms of what is possible outside of these walls. Because he's a child, she really has to do her best to kind of create a world that's kind of an ideal, right? A world that they want to live in. so that maybe one day when he grows up, he can kind of fight for said world. The drama begins in the prison canteen when the news broadcasts announcements about the 1982 Israeli war in Lebanon. Like, this causes complete chaos. Briefly, I'm not going to do a deep dive. I'll just touch on it and then you guys can go and do your deep dive. So in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon during the country's 15-year civil war, and the stated aim of this invasion was to destroy the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And they say that this organization was based in Beirut and it was launching attacks on them from southern Lebanon. One of the inmates in this prison her name is Sana, and she is a Lebanese freedom fighter. And so when she hears the news, she demands access to information, which of course she's totally denied. And just generally, although she's Lebanese, this is a very good commentary in terms of the very limited access that Palestinians have to sort of the politics in Israel. So Palestinians with Israeli citizenship have very limited political power, and they're actually very much perceived like as an enemy within, right? So even though they have citizenship, it's still an apartheid system, right? Like, you still don't have the same degree of power as your Israeli counterparts. Wants information, she doesn't have it, and the guards are done, they turn off the TV. So things take an even darker turn when one of the Israelis smuggles them in a newspaper, and this newspaper contained information about the Sabra and Shatila massacre, and this is when all chaos breaks loose. The Palestinian Liberation Organization withdrew from Lebanon with the promise that the remaining refugee camps in Lebanon would be protected. 2 weeks later, of course, they broke their agreement and a genocide took place at the Palestinian refugee camp in Sabra and Shatila. The backing of invading Israeli forces, the right-wing Lebanese Christian group called the Falaj basically just went in and wreaked havoc. They went into the refugee camp under the guise of looking for soldiers, right? Like this idea of human shield. Instead, what happened is that they assaulted, tortured, mutilated, maimed individuals for nearly 40 hours, killing around 3,500 people. And this Israeli army was accused of basically allowing it to happen, like standing by and just watching the massacre occur. And of course, nobody was ever put on trial for it. And this is, to this day, like, these families are still trying to hold somebody accountable. Like, accountability seems to be, it's very difficult for the world to hold Israel accountable for anything, it seems. Massacre was actually so horrifying that it shook the world, and it also shook a lot of Israelis' opinions of their own government. So in the movie, as well as in real life, Palestinian women declared a major strike to better their conditions and to be recognized as political prisoners. It is actually very interesting to know, like, you notice in the movie that there's an Israeli woman that gives them a newspaper, and this was actually common during this time. So a lot of Israelis would actually smuggle in letters and newspapers to fellow Palestinian inmates, kind of as some sense of camaraderie. It's at this point in the film that Leal has to choose between loyalty to the cause or loyalty to her child, right? Like, this is where she's at. So she's thrown into solitary confinement with her son Noor, and even though she's very afraid, she tries her best to keep her son's imagination alive. Draws what would be like a huge portrait later, right? Like, just really trying to paint a picture of the outside world that isn't as ugly as what he's currently witnessing. Like, she tries her best to keep his spirits alive and keep that optimism, keep that fight going. And it was really actually beautiful to see that all the inmates were trying their best to keep this child happy, right? Like, you can kind of, as he gets older and older, they're very much trying to make sure that he's doing well. Before Leal is about to give up, right? So the guards kind of place psychological torture and they remove Leal from the group and says, you need to stop this strike or we're gonna take your child away from you. And at first she wasn't convinced, but slowly she was starting to get on board. That is until she saw one of her fellow inmates with the Israeli guards, and she realized who was giving them information, right? And this prisoner, her name is Rihan, and like, herself, Rihan is a mother, and her logic was very sound. She's like, listen, we're mothers, we have everything to lose. If we don't tell these people information, we're gonna be lost in this system forever. And as much as I hated what Rihan did, I understand her logic. You know, it sounds cruel, but again, this movie is very careful to really try to articulate that resisting against such a system, it's not easy, right? It's easier said than done, and sometimes people really have to kind of save themselves in order to survive. Layal, of course, is very angry. She's very frustrated. And she gets an opportunity to tell Sanaa, this Lebanese freedom fighter, who the snitch was. This basically causes a huge fight, a huge row. So the prisoners have been very vocal about having a strike, to the point where the men started joining them. So the guards are trying time and time again to kind of suppress them, to kind of keep them quiet, but it's not working. So as soon as Layal tells Sanaa about the snitch, all like chaos breaks loose, right? They start fighting. And then suddenly one of the guards on the roof indiscriminately starts shooting and shoots this young girl. And then this is what basically triggers things to get even worse. And this young girl that they shot, like, she couldn't have been more than 15. And that's the other thing to know, like, political prisoners in Israel, like, they can be 15. Like, these girls, there's two sisters in this movie, and I believe they were just taken out of school randomly. And this is a thing that happened. So they're 15 and they could have been in the jail forever, right? Like, this girl that was shot was repeatedly tortured, placed in stress positions just because the guard thought she could. And now she was killed because, you know, he was just shooting. And so she dies, no accountability. The inmates feel like they have absolutely nothing to lose, and they lock the guards out of the prison and take over the prison. They're like, you know what, we have nothing to lose. The situation is going to get worse. And actually, it probably would have gotten worse. So in Israeli law, they can declare like a state of emergency in prison, which somehow allows them to make life inside the prison worse, which is really strange to say. So they can deprive them of more food, basic conditions. So again, they're very much subject to military law. So at any point in time, the guards can decide it's a state of emergency and shut everything down. So it was funny to watch the inmates declare the state of emergency and shut them out. So eventually the guards are able to use tear gas and excessive force. And actually the use of tear gas in prisons was a huge problem during this time because of all the hunger strikes, of all the protests, of all the abuse going on inside these prisons. So they use excessive force and they basically just tear gas them and regain control of the prison. But luckily for the women, the men were able to actually capture 6 Israeli guards. And because of that, they were able to negotiate the release of a number of prisoners. And this is what kind of offers a somewhat happy ending for some of the inmates. So prisoner exchanges are actually very important in the Palestinian resistance movements for many, many different reasons. Palestinians in prison are there for not really good reason, and they're in there for ridiculous periods of time. So without this prisoner exchange, there would actually be no way for them to leave prison. Like, there are people who've been sentenced to 5,000 years. Like, it's actually crazy. Like, if you look it up, like, I encourage you, I'll link it down below. There's an Amnesty International report that basically just highlights that, first of all, that Israel is an apartheid state, but just the insanity of this system. So prisoner exchanges are crucial because it actually garners freedom. Believe it or not, these prisoner exchanges not only include prisoners who are alive, but they include prisoners who are dead as well. What do I mean by that? So Israeli emergency law allows the military to bury the bodies of martyrs, so those who were killed, and hold them for the purpose of using them as bargaining chips for any sort of future negotiations in exchanges that can be made with Palestinians. So they actually keep the bodies in case they need them later, right? If you want to bury your son or daughter, we're going to have to make a deal. And so this is actually an illegal form of collective punishment, and it was something that the Israelis inherited from British colonial rule. The Israeli government, so the occupation, holds these bodies in either refrigerators or numbered graves, just refuses to allow the relatives to mourn their loss, right? So once an inmate dies, literally serve out the remainder of their sentence either in a fridge or a grave. Like, it is wild. And so a lot of times parents, you know, a lot of these families, they don't even have someone, they don't have a grave to go to, right? They don't have anywhere to mourn because they refuse to release these bodies, like, you really need to process that. Prisoner exchange in the movie very much mirrors an actual prison exchanges. So during this time, Palestinian Liberation Organization was able to free nearly 5,000 prisoners in exchange for 6 Israeli soldiers. So it's not like a small thing. Like, if they're able to capture soldiers or high-ranking officials, they can very well release thousands of Palestinians and like, if not all, depending on who they're able to capture. Like, it's not a small thing. So the Israeli government seems to very much weirdly value their soldiers enough to do something like this. The movie ends with Layal being reunited with her son, and just to note, just her leaving the prison is incredibly, like, crazy. Like, she could have had administrative detention at the end of it, right? But instead she gets out and she's reunited with her son, and that last scene, like, you do feel her pain, and this movie is incredibly well acted, and I do feel like this was incredibly personal for the people involved. Like, you do feel her exhaustion, right? She kind of comes in as a kid, and 8 years later, you know, she has a child. Like, her life was totally just put on pause. The end credits of this movie are really fantastic because they show the results of this prisoner exchange. So you actually see people being reunited with their families, being super, like, thankful to see them, because again, like, once you're lost in this system, you might never ever get out. The movie also ends with footage of Israelis just arresting people, you know, nonsensically, children, women. Like, they just arrest people at a whim, and there's not much you can do once you're behind bars. Like, it's really, it can totally just derail your life. So since the 1980s, the conditions in Israeli prisons have gotten significantly worse. Not only that, they're entertaining the death penalty. And again, it's not that difficult to break the law when you're a Palestinian living in this area. Liking a tweet, retweeting, posting, speaking, breathing, walking, like, all of these things are considered crimes over there. And I'm not even exaggerating, but the idea of the death penalty is actually quite dangerous because it's kind of a form of genocide. It's another way to kind of reduce the numbers. And so there's a deep-seated belief that peace will only come if Arabs love their children more than they hate us, so more than they hate the Israelis. And I thought that's why the movie was very clever in centering the story around a mother's love for her child. Because this tension between, you know, the love for your child and the love for your country, like, they're one and the same, right? She will fight as hard for her children as she will for her country. And as long as that type of love exists, it's very hard for them to beat it out of them, right? It's like they keep trying to beat it out of them. They keep trying to abuse, but it's not working, right? And I really like that she was trying to paint a picture for her child of an ideal world, or of an ideal Palestine beyond these walls, right? Because this is very much true. Now, how long it will take to get there, you know, this is uncertain. But one thing is they are very sure about, which is that they will get there, no matter how hard you kind of try to beat that spirit out of them. So overall, I highly recommend this movie. Let me know what you think. So until next time.